Okay, can you hear me out there? I'm going to do this now for the online audience who has been so patient. Um, Hi, everybody. Sorry about the delay. My name is John Torpy. I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies and a professor in the PhD programs in sociology and history here at the Graduate Center. And I'm very pleased to be here to celebrate the advent of the Circle for Late Antique and Medieval Studies. Some might think that this endeavor is not really the kind of province of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, which, after all, has long been a nest of political scientists, not always known for their historical interests and orientations. But I've learned over the years that we usually cannot understand major contemporary political developments without having a sense of their historical roots. The Circle for Late Antique and Medieval Studies focuses our attention on the transformations of the ancient world that remain with us today. These transformations include the shift from antique Roman history and the birth of a universalistic Christianity to Byzantium and the creation of more local/national Christian orthodoxies, followed by Islam arising both to continue and to reject the so-called Abrahamic lineage or tradition. Soon, Islam spread across the Earth's equatorial zones from Iberia to Indonesia. And the contests between Islam and other axial age religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, left a legacy that still marks the modern world today. And to some extent, following Max Weber, Samuel Huntington a few years ago took these transformations as the basis of a diagnosis for world politics across the board after the demise of the Soviet Union. Now, Huntington's analysis isn't necessarily the last word on these matters, but it was the kind of thing that stimulated discussion and controversy for a long time and even to this day. So although it may seem to be about the distant past, the Circle for Late Antique and Medieval Studies can help us understand our own world. And I want to thank our colleague Parvane Pourshariati for spearheading this initiative and thus helping us all to understand some of the deep roots of contemporary world politics. I also want to conclude by thanking the co-sponsors of this event, the PhD programs in history, in classics, and in archaeology, as well as the Middle East and Middle East American Center, NEMIAC, here at the Graduate Center. So as soon as he arrives, I'll turn the mic over to Parvane to introduce Professor Bullet.
share the screen now or later? Should I start
Go ahead
sharing
and
it?
share it.
Keep it like this?
But I've given my introduction. Okay.
May I introduce you? Yes, please. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Thank you very much for um, for coming to us, and thank you very much for being with us, people online. We are very sorry. I am particularly sorry. It was my fault that it was an Uber situation that our speaker got here late, so I take all the responsibility. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. Um, I, I had everything prepared, but I just wanted to tell you, I'm sure that the John introduced himself. He is the director of Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies and the director of European Studies Center, presidential professor in sociology and history, and he works on social and critical theory, comparative historical sociology, sociology of religion and political science. He has authored many books. I have at least I don't know, a dozen of them here. And I won't go through it with you, but I'm sure that John has talked to you about the circle, but I wanted to also tell you something also. I wanted to thank John for actually introducing the center. Um, I went, this has been going on. I have been thinking about this for the past 10 years or so, but finally I was seeing some speaker on the Ralph Bunche Institute site, and I saw somebody working on Ukraine, and throughout I was thinking, you know, but there's such a history to this, such a history to this, and and then I actually contacted Meryl, uh, Meryl Sovner, who sort of acro what is the word? Abracadabras everything into being. Yes, thank you so much, Meryl, for that. And I wrote to her and I said, but there is such a history to it. I don't think it took 24 hours before Meryl sort of replied to me and said, we're very interested on behalf of John. And since then, they have been um, they have been absolutely incredible with the help that they have given me with setting up the everything for us, and for finally having a room for and a space for late antique and medieval studies, and I'm grateful to him. I also wanted to thank a number of colleagues that I'm sure John has already done that. Yes, John? I would also like to thank all our colleagues, Professor Macaulay, Professor Akosai, Professor um, Beth, Beth last name, Beth Barron, Professor Beth Barron, Sarah McDougall. Everybody has been so enormously helpful in setting up this circle. And, this is one time that I didn't have to talk extensively and shout our sort of field out without, I mean, I didn't do it. And John and Meryl and everybody at the center has been extremely, extremely helpful. And I thank them sincerely for everything. Now, well, for all the support that you have given us, I think you're splendid, John. Only half schmoozing here. Yeah. So thank you for those of you who have come to our audience. Thank you very much. Um, those of you who are physically present and those of who are on online. Um, I would like to thank you very much for joining us for the inaugural lecture by one of the great thinkers um, of 20th and 21st century, Emeritus Professor of Columbia University now, Professor Richard Bullitt, for accepting to be our inaugural speaker, and I'm sure we are in for it. For a treat. By the way, my name is Parvane Pushayati, and I'm an associate professor of history at City Tech. Well, I'm one of the many excellent students of our speaker tonight. Some would say that I am a better excellent speaker, not excellent speaker, better excellent student. Yeah, I'm just kidding, right? There are people in my class that are hopefully up there. Um, so it is a very hard task to introduce Richard Bullitt because he has had such a rich, productive, and impeccable sort of influence of the currents of late antique and medieval studies in the field, in academia. As you know, he has his writings and books have put forth theories that to date have not been substituted by newer theories, such is the case with his Conversion to Islam, which is the best scientific theory on the subject as far as I'm concerned. His writing on the history of technology, he is a man of science, history of science, and he's contributed tremendously to the field. His writing on the history of technology in such works as Camel and the Wheel, for which he got a Dexter Prize, Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran, Hunters and Herders, and Hamburgers, The Past and Future of Human-Animal Relationship. Each of these have looked at the medieval world from a vantage point that has rarely been seen by others. I really cannot go over all the accolades that Dick Bullitt has had. We would have had a pajama party if I were to do all of that. But I, with at least a dozen books and with 60 scholarly articles, 30 essays, 75 book reviews, approximately 100 encyclopedia articles, TV series, 70 campus visits, and 300 radio and television interviews. You know that you're in the presence of a great figure in the field. Of all his accolades, Guggenheim fellowships, and the time that he spent at Columbia in being the chair of the history department for 15 years, the director of Middle East Institute, the chair of the anthropology department, and you know, many services to the field. I will not take more of your time, ladies and gentlemen. I introduce you Professor Richard Bullitt, to Professor Richard Bullitt of Columbia University. Thank you.
Thank you, Parvane, for going on that way. I could have listened for another half hour, I think. When Parvane asked me to give this opening talk, she said it should be on the date when we move from late antiquity to medieval times. And then, in view of my years, she asked if there were any personal reminiscences I had of the transition. And I said, no, unless we're talking about Eisenhower to Kennedy or something, which actually makes a lot of sense. But the question of on what date do we shift from late antiquity to medieval times? I won't hold you in suspense. The year is 900. Thank you very much. I think I will have to justify that date. When you're talking about eras, it's always very awkward. Anybody can name an era or announce that an era has passed or has transitioned from one to another. But it gets very difficult if the eras are sort of not in the same category. I think, for example, of how Marshall Hodgson thought we could go from eras defined by the caliphate to eras defined by gunpowder, which these are two very different things. But the most successful transitions in talking about eras really deal with technology, whether it's going from to the Iron Age or the Neolithic or the age of steam or things like that. And so it's in the technological realm that I will approach this, even though some people would probably prefer to think of it as deriving from the rise of Islam. From my point of view, what marks the end of the era is the change in the transport system. Now, when I started thinking about this and decided that the year 900 was the year that I wanted to use, I really had not kept in mind that Michael McCormick has written an enormous book on the birth of the European economy, covering the period from 300 to 900. So there is a certain convergence here that he doesn't talk about the Middle East or Islamic areas at all in his book, which is massively detailed for Europe. But it appears that the change that I see becoming fully instituted by the year 900 parallels changes that he saw occurring in Europe and talks about in great detail. I'm not going to pursue that at all, but I do think it's interesting that there is this convergence. All right, my hypothesis is that the creation or the coming into being of a transport system that is technologically and zoologically, let us say, a uniform from the Atlantic Ocean to New Delhi, or to Delhi, Old Delhi. That this creates a geographical zone that is so distinctive and so unprecedented that it deserves to be singled out as the basis of an era. And yet it is rarely talked about. The camel caravans are at the essence of the whole thing. And the camel caravans are the cheapest form of overland transport, really, that has ever been devised down to practically to modern times. There was a study done long ago by a economist at Penn, working with colleagues in Pakistan. And they looked at the costs associated with using camels for laboring purposes in Pakistan. Purposes such as running, operating mills or water wheels, or water lifting devices, or transporting goods. And they found that in the bookkeeping of a man who provided camels to various end users, that his accounting included so much for medical care, so much for acquiring the animal, so much for equipment, and then it had cost for 350 working days in the year, 0 food cost, and the cost for all of the non-working days in the year, food costs were 0, because the camel could live on waste vegetation that had no other purpose and did not need to be fed any kind of specialized fodder that of the sort that other animals require, nor did it consume products grown on land that could have been devoted to, say, food for humans. So I thought, well, this is extraordinary. This is a free source of energy, or the camel is a converter of essentially waste products growing in the desert to useful energy. The consequence of this is that when you look at the cost of moving goods from one place to another, the cost is extremely low. In a camel caravan, typically it starts early in the morning. It covers about 20 miles until sort of late afternoon or early evening. Then it stops, and the animals are released to graze if it is in desert country. Normally, one of the forelegs is tied in a bent position with a leather strap, so the camel has to graze on 3 legs, which means it cannot travel very far. Still, in the morning, the camel pullers have to go out and find the camels who have wandered off in the night, but they have fed during that time. But even if there is no such desert grazing available, the camel can go without food for an extended period of time, literally for months, because the energy contained in the fat of which composes the hump on the camel can be drawn on during a period of prolonged fasting. So the result is that you can travel, you can carry a load of goods, let's say 500 pounds of goods, maybe 350, depending on the size of the camel. You can carry these goods 1,000 miles, and your energy cost is essentially 0. There is no other overland way of doing this that even in modern times, you have the gasoline costs for carrying those goods. And the conclusion of the study that was done in Pakistan was that camels still, in the late 20th century, could compete for economy with the cheapest form of motorized transport available in Pakistan. So there is an economy there that's extraordinary. But access to that economy has certain limitations. One is that you have to have someone who is herding the camels, who knows where the camels are and can make them available to merchants or caravan organizers who need to bring them into a caravan. And that means that you have a human element, typically nomadic, because the camels range very far in their grazing, and you need to have people who will follow the camels or lead the camels and to pastures that will change seasonally. And these nomads, almost of necessity, live at a very, very basic level of material consumption, because they have to carry their various goods, camp goods and so forth, with them. So when you have an economy that shifts to transport by camel caravan, it's also an economy that incorporates nomads as an essential part of the economic system. And this is important because literally for thousands of years, and in many different settings around the world, nomads have tended to be excluded or feared, whether they were horse nomads in Central Asia or camel nomads. They're being part of the economic and social system was always problematic until you had the creation of the camel caravan zone. Exactly how nomads enter into this situation hasn't been studied very well. My own view is that the rise of the Arabs to be dominant in the Middle East, which we associate with the rise of Islam, is actually in substantial part a shift of camel growers as an ancillary part of the necessary but ancillary part of the economic system to dominating that system. And yet the political situation in which the Arabs found themselves after the conquest of the 7th century was in many respects a continuation of Mesopotamian empires that go back to the Akkadians and the Elamites and the Kassites and the Achaemenids and so forth, and that you did not have a marked change at the very top, but the personnel who were engaged at the very top changed. It had happened before historically, say with the Kassites, but we don't know very much about that era, long before. So this is where I start in thinking about a change of eras. And the thing is, you can't have camel caravans unless you have camels. And you can't have camels unless you have camel herders, at least economically. So the question arises of when did the camels extend their range over this truly extensive territory where the camel caravan becomes the dominant mode of transport. Every historian who's ever written about the coming of Europeans to the Western Hemisphere has talked about the importance of horses and how the horses enabled the Europeans to do this and that, and how the horses were adopted by certain Plains Indians or other indigenous peoples, and how this is really a marvelous example of how an animal can transform a whole section of the world. The spread of camels has as great an impact as a spread of the spread of horses, but we don't have any real study of that. I wrote about aspects of this 50 years ago in my book, The Camel and the Wheel. But I never thought at that time to actually try and map out in a systematic way, when did camels reach from one place to another? Let me see. Here we start out camel herding around 300 BCE. As you can see, we're basically talking about the Arabian desert and its extensions up into Jordan and Syria and Iraq. I want you, by the way, to pause to admire the artistic quality of the presentation. I paid a great deal to get a professional pencil scribbler. Cy Twombly offered, but I wouldn't accept it. He couldn't stay within the lines. So here you have 300 BCE. I picked that because it's the period of the rise of the first caravan city in Petra. But as you can see, you have the Arabian Peninsula and you have Somalia. Now, Somalia was then and continues today to be distinct in that the Somali camels are not used for transporting things other than camp goods. There has been no indigenous Somali caravan experience, and the types of saddles that the Somalis use are very poorly adapted for carrying the sort of baggage you would have in a typical camel caravan. And so the result is that Somalia, northern Kenya, up into Eritrea, does not really fit into the camel caravan pattern. So for caravan work, we're talking about the extended Arabian Peninsula, 300 BCE. Now we're talking about 300 CE. We've moved now from the rise of Petra to the era of Palmyra, the second great caravan city. But by this time, dealing with the Roman Empire, you can see that you've gotten a few camels into Egypt and along the northern Roman-held coast of North Africa up to Numidia, up to Algeria, but not into, I don't believe. And then you have apparently some camels being used for transport across northern Iran. We have at least one image of a one-hump camel from Penjikent out in Uzbekistan. And then you have an extension of camels across the southern edge of the Sahara Desert and the Sahel region bordering the southern Sahara. And it's very important to look at those two African areas as separate from one another. This has, I think, not been attended to closely enough. If you look at the Roman pattern in the north, you find that it's clearly derivative from what you have in the Levant, that the types of saddles in use are Levantine. But when you get over into northwestern Libya and Tunisia, there is a great deal of visual evidence in this time frame, 300 CE, of camels being used as farm animals on Roman farms. And this takes the form of camels pulling plows and camels pulling wagons. I remember reading about this for the first time in sort of what used to be the most voluminous, well, still is the most voluminous work on camels by a Commandant Covey of the French Camel Corps in North Africa. But Covey talked about how even to this day, you could find camel carts being pulled in rural areas on the Cap Bon Peninsula in Tunisia. So I went to Tunisia and I took a train to the Cap Bon Peninsula, and thinking this is probably as foolish as the moment when I and a friend from the US Army, stood out in the desert trying to light camel dung on fire with a Zippo lighter to see how easy it was. And it just seemed, this is really a foolish thing to be doing. And I thought this was equally foolish. I got out of the train in Nabil, the primary city in the Cap Bon Peninsula, and there was a cart being pulled by a camel right at the station. I mean, not 50 meters away. And as it moved off, I followed it, feeling a little bit foolish as well. I had no idea where this cart was going, but eventually it stopped, and I was able to take pictures and carefully study the harnessing for camel carts. And then as I was walking back into town, I passed a gentleman who was using a camel for pulling a plow. And so I studied that as well. Now, this is the only place in the world where you find camel carts of this variety. You do have them in Pakistan, and that's a totally different development. But here you had camel carts and camel plowing. And when you look at the bas-reliefs from the Roman period, you realize that the technology has continued there from Roman imperial times, and that the type of harnessing being used is actually a counterpart of what's considered modern horse harnessing. Okay. Now, the southern side of the Sahara Desert. Yeah, thank you. The southern side of the Sahara Desert does not have any camel carts, does not have any camel plowing, does not have any plowing at all. There is no native Berber, or Tuareg word for plow or yoke. The saddles that are used southern Sahara are derivative from Arabian saddles, but they're adapted almost entirely to personal transport. So that, and they are the best riding saddles in the world. They perch the rider in front of the hump on the shoulders of the animal, and with his toes in the bend of the neck of the camel to guide it, so that they can wield weapons, basically a military saddle. But there was no caravan operating in the Southern Sahara. And the camels in the north, the camels in the south, did not interbreed. This is a totally different connection. For one thing, in the south, the monsoon system dictated a spring breeding season, whereas in the north, the Mediterranean weathering pattern dictated an autumn breeding season for the camels. And so they went into rut at different times. And you can see the difference, so that the camels on the southern side of the Sahara look, down to today, look different from the ones in the north. In the south, you have particularly highly esteemed pure white camels called Biharis. And you also have piebald camels, because they're, glad they say splotchy black and white camels, because there is a cultural preference, or at least not entirely, well, I guess it is a preference. Along the in the Sahel and along the southern Sahara, there's a very strong cultural preference for animals of mixed coat color. So you have piebald donkeys, piebald camels, piebald sheep, and so on. So we have, while the camels spread, and you have camel herders spreading, particularly in the southern Sahara, they're not used there for commerce. Now, let's go to 700 CE. This is, after the Arab conquest, and it's not dramatically different, but there are some significant differences here. In the east, there's a sort of a splotchy area in Turkmenistan, another one in northern Afghanistan. These were the great centers for the Arab armies, in Marv in Turkmenistan and in Balkh in Afghanistan, bringing very large numbers of one-hump camels with them for the logistic train of the army as it went across northern Iran. Southern Iran doesn't appear to have been developed yet that much as a camel area. In the north of the Sahara Desert, you'll notice that Algeria and Morocco are now incorporated into the camel zone. And that's an interesting development, because when you look at the nomads who inhabit or used to inhabit the northern Sahara and move to the various oases in the northern Sahara, of which there's a whole string of oases. In the 20th century, I'm not sure it happens now, but earlier in the 20th century, the French data make it very clear that they were accustomed to throwing seeds on the ground, plowing up the ground on the edge of an oasis, throwing some seeds down, and then going away and coming back several months later to see if anything had grown. The plow harness that the nomads would use in those oases was identical to the plow harness that the Romans used. And I think it's fairly clear that what happened is that as the Roman agricultural economy of northwest Libya and Tunisia more or less collapsed with the end of the grain shipments to the city of Rome, that the indigenous farm workers for the Roman farms took the livestock and went off on their own. And I think this is where the nomadic tradition of the northern Sahara becomes very distinctive, that it has an original base in Roman agricultural usage. Also in the Roman times, we have images that show that the camels could carry amphorae in wooden, in rather elaborate wooden um, cages that would keep the amphorae from breaking and so on. And it appears that the camels therefore could be used to carry wine or olive oil or garum, the three great liquids that were used in seafaring in the Mediterranean. But by this time, the use of amphorae on camel back seems to have disappeared. On the southern side of the Sahara, you've had an expansion of the nomadic zone. It links now down through Sudan to Somalia, but the Somali technological tradition and the Sudanese are completely different. So the Somali retains its distinctive qualities. Now, if I move on to the year 1000, by this time, the caravan system has been fully realized. One-hump camels are found throughout Iran, throughout Turkmenistan, which previously had only had two-hump camels, throughout Afghanistan, and there appear to have been developments in terms of the personnel taking care of the camels, herding the camels in these areas. We don't know, it seems, exactly when the Baluch came to Baluchistan, which is in southern Iran and edging into southern Afghanistan and the western province of Pakistan. The Baluch are camel herders, but exactly when they got into this area, it's not known. Before them, you had Brahui speakers who could herd camels. You also had people we don't know much about called Kufs or Kuch Baluch. It's all very, very poorly documented, but clearly you had a camel culture in Afghanistan, south of the Hindu Kush Mountains, and in southern and central Iran. In the Sahara, you now had regular routes of transport across the Sahara that did not mix livestock, but they did establish caravans. Okay, so the caravan system now extends from Afghanistan across to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's now a fairly uniform system all the way across. Here's 1300. By this time, this is at the end of the Mongol supremacy in Iran. By this time, you have camels reaching into northern India, one-hump camels in Pakistan. In the north, you have camels extending up north of the Caspian Sea and going over as far as the Crimea and going up the Volga Valley. And you also have Turkey now as part of the camel zone. How much camel presence there was in Eastern Europe is a matter of some debate. Maurizio Dioli, an Italian camel specialist, whom I haven't met, but whose work seems very impressive, has found documentary evidence of camels being used in Europe, including a wonderful picture of a butcher shop giving price for camel meat along with others. But the camels that you had in Europe were hybrid camels, which means they probably are related to the ones in Crimea and Turkey more than elsewhere. The hybrid camels, called in Arabic bukht, are stronger than either their one hump or their two hump parent. But they are specifically bred by having a two-humped sire and a one-humped dam, which means wherever you have the two-hump camels, you have to have had breeding herds that were primarily of the one-hump variety, with the two-humped male servicing a large number of one-hump female camels. The virtue of the hybrid animal, in addition to its enormous strength, is that it is much more resistant to cold than the normal one-hump camel, so that extending it up into the Volga Valley and Crimea and so forth, exposing the camels to actually winter weather. This was a new development of the, let's say, of the 11th through the 14th century. And then rather late, in the 15th or perhaps in the 16th, perhaps even later, you have the development in Western Turkey of camel wrestling, which only uses hybrid camels. And the camel wrestling, which in late medieval times we find visual evidence of in India and Pakistan, shows up in Turkey, in the coastal areas of Western Turkey, down to the present day, where it's quite a tourist attraction and is considered to be part of Turkish culture. But it appears rather late, and the animals have to be the hybrid variety, supposedly brought in from Crimea or bred in Eastern Turkey. This is all really not well studied. This entire development, where you're taking the extent of camels in Arabia and Syria and Iraq, Jordan, where you originate a pattern of caravan use, now extends so you can have a camel caravan that goes from Delhi to, say, to Rabat in Morocco, and it will encounter the same technological transport universe over that entire distance. Or they can go from Yemen up into Turkmenistan, and you'll have the same technological universe. This, I would suggest, creates a unified economic zone that is dramatically different from what you had in Europe in anything like this time period. And yet it is not a zone that is governed from any central point. And this is one of the turning points that you get with the year 900. In the 800s, the caliphate based in Baghdad, and as a sort of continuation of the Mesopotamian imperial center, the caliphate struggles to hang on to its centrality and its institutional dominance through the 800s. And in the 900s, that struggle is lost. And you start to have, in almost all areas, separate polities of different sorts, particularly to those areas. And yet the transport economy, the lifeline of the entire society, is the same in all of these successor states to the caliphate, with the possible exception of Spain, where the history of camels in Spain is, I can't find anyone who's written about it. And I have found in one book on hunting, a man hunting camels in the marshes of southern Spain. So clearly there was something there at some time, but I don't know what. So this is not a political thing. It's not a cultural thing. This is not exclusively Muslims, but technologically and economically, it is a system. Let me point out that if you're talking about moving goods and people, the distances involved and the times involved are much greater in the camel zone than in Europe, and that you have people involved in caravan work who will go from one place to another and spend 3 months getting there and then go back. This is not just a few people. There's an enormous amount of personal migration that occurs within this zone. We sometimes look at Europe, and this is what one of the things Michael McCormick does, in terms of pilgrimage narratives of people who go to Constantinople or Antioch or Jerusalem or Rome or Santiago de Compostela, and we know something about them and their experiences. In the Islamic world, the equivalent of pilgrimage is not going to Mecca, but rather going in search of hadith. In other words, the comparison is not specifically to the European pilgrim going to a Holy Land and trying to find the finger bone of Saint Fulan to use to start a church back when he got home, but rather of the Chinese pilgrims who go to India to find the sutras for the spread of Buddhism into China. People who go to the center of a religious cult to find themselves and to find mementos of the origin are so numerous in the Islamic world that we hardly even notice them. We have biographical dictionaries that show that thousands upon thousands of people were traveling in search of the sayings of the prophet. For Nishapur, which I am best informed about, it's not uncommon for someone to travel from Nishapur to Yemen. Nishapur to Mecca is 103 days. Nishapur to Yemen, you can add another 40 days or so, maybe only 20 days. But in other words, this is non-trivial personal transport. And these people who moved with the caravans, both for safety and because a substantial number of them were engaged in trade and use their trade goods, buying and selling, to sustain their long period away from home. So this is another feature that makes the camel caravan zone different from medieval Europe. Medieval Europe was highly parochial developments, local dialects, local customs, local costumes, limited mobility, small numbers of people moving about, a clergy that are very much, you know, situated in a specific place. They aren't even supposed to travel without the permission of their bishop. And then here in the camel caravan zone, you know, an enormous amount of personal transport involving scholars, merchants, obviously religious men, because the scholars and the religious men are similar. And yet, if you were interested in studying astronomy or medicine, you would also be traveling in a similar fashion. Another distinct difference is that in the camel caravan zone, you have very large inland cities that are not on navigable water. Now that might not seem terribly important, but the cost of bringing food overland to a city is enormous. And everyone who writes about overland transport comments about how you simply could not expect to bring food from more than 100 miles away and turn any kind of profit on it. With a city like Nishapur, which had, say, between 100 and 200,000 people and no rivers and no seaports anywhere near, my calculation is they must have had something on the order of 3,000 camel loads of stuff per day to sustain a city of that size. I mean, this means charcoal, it means food, it means goods for industrial purposes, and particularly for Nishapur, for the cotton industry, which was the mainstay. So that's another feature, is that from Morocco to Pakistan, big inland cities that do not have navigable water. I think that the caravan merchants in the dawning of this system in the Roman era and in the transition to the Islamic era, I think they adopted a particular desire to destroy their competition. I wrote about this long ago in The Camel and the Wheel, pointing out that in Palmyra, there was a burdensome tariff placed on anyone who brought a wagon load of goods to Palmyra. That did not apply to people who brought a camel load of goods to Palmyra. And of course, the ox carts all disappeared. But I think that the striking thing for me with the dawn of the Islamic period is the Islamic prohibition on drinking wine. Wine would appear to be the most important transport commodity of late antiquity. The ships that are discovered sunk in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea are so many times full of amphorae that carried wine or olive oil or garum. Liquid transport by ship works very well because you put your amphorae on the ship when you start, and you unload it when you get to the other end. Let's say Lyon in France, an enormous number of amphorae, and from the Roman period are still preserved. But if you put an amphora on a camel, it has to be loaded and unloaded at least once or twice a day for hundreds of days. And it's unlikely that wine would really sustain itself, its drinkability over the distances and the time periods that you have for caravan work. But it was clearly terribly profitable. Everybody drank it. It was considered, in fact, in the earliest Christian strictures for clergy in the Middle Eastern area, it was considered a fault for a priest not to drink wine. I mean, you really had to. Mecca, we know, was full of wine drinkers. The wine poetry flourished. And in fact, drinking wine has always been a favorite thing to do. It's the transport of wine that I think the caravan merchants were trying to suppress. And that was the purpose of the prohibition or on drinking wine that becomes sort of absolute in Islamic law, even though people understand it variously. But that's just a whim I've had, along with the notion as the amphorae in Europe disappear, the amphorae are replaced by a container from the Germanic area of the barrel. So barrels and casks and so forth become the standard for liquid transport in Europe during this period of transition that McCormick writes about. You have no barrel industry in the Islamic world in the medieval period. You simply don't have it. You don't have any words to describe barrels, much less barrel makers. So what I'd summarize that is that I think that camel caravans favored dry goods, particularly fabrics, dried food, spices, whereas the late antique maritime economy favored wet goods, wine, garum, which was a food sauce the Romans liked, and particularly wine, wine, olive oil, and garum. So I think it's probably about time for me to wind this up. Now, why 900? I think that it's the end of the Mesopotamian empire pattern that had lasted for millennia, and it's the time when you have enough camels and enough camel herders over a prodigious geographical area to make possible a unified economic system that had distinctive characteristics. I've mentioned a common technology, a common use of the internal inland cities and so forth, but there are numerous other characteristics, including the necessity of having nomads in the economy. So I think that this is like any other major transition. It's a gradual process, and picking a single date is of convenience, but it's only suggestive, and yet it is suggestive. And I'd suggest 900 is the year we want to look at for the transition point between late antiquity and medieval. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bullitt, for that really inspiring and unique perspective that you have provided. It is, I have worked on issues of distances and trade myself. Dick, I will bring a sure. Like, here you go. Thank you so much. Oh, okay, okay. Okay. I have been working on these issues, on issues of trade and the roots of trade and the commodities of trade and whatnot myself quite a bit, but I never I mean, I did pay attention to distances and all of that, and I've been preoccupied with that. But what is, I have never, I have never looked at the subject through the technology of transport. And this is truly incredible to me that we could, as I mentioned before, we could view it from Richard's perspective, right? And you know, I can say for almost for certain, I don't know, that that um, that you know, well, I forgot my train of thought. Yeah. But no, I was going to say actually that I am almost certain that nobody has worked on the issue from the perspective of Dick Bullitt. I have myself a number of questions from him, but we are, this is the way we're going to proceed, colleagues. We are going to take one question from the audience and one from our viewers. So as we have quite a number of viewers, I would like to ask you to please forward your questions to us, and we'll start with the floor. Thank you very much, Dick.
I can't imagine, given the incredible clarity, not to mention the artwork of the lecture, that anyone could have a question, but I see people here who are of a questioning mind. So, yes.
I'm not sure I understood exactly what you said. So what explained sort of where the camel caravan idea started and why it expanded to the particular places that it did in the pattern? Did that have to do with, the discovery that this was a good idea among people who had interacted before? Did it have, I mean, for example, there was a big empty spot at, I think, 300 CE in the middle of the Sahara. Did that have to do with a lack of water, or because eventually it gets filled in? So I'm just curious if you could talk about the pattern as it builds in, as
Right.
the artwork shows us.
Right. Yes. That's why the artwork is so important. The okay. The question that I've been asked from the live audience here is what could explain the particular pattern in which the caravan system expanded, particularly given things like the emptiness of the Central Sahara, in before it becomes sort of all filled in. I have two things on that. One is, where does the caravan system originate? My notion on this, which I published 50 years ago, and which the camel people have not been totally thrilled with the dating I have. But I believe that the first camel caravans were used for incense trade with ancient Egypt. The incense would be carried by boat because the Egyptians were very much into seafaring. But in southern Arabia, the island of Socotra and Somalia, you had incense trees, and the consumption of incense in Egypt was enormous in quantity. So they had to have many, many ships that were bringing incense from Somalia and southern Arabia back. And I think that if you go to Yemen, you can go and you can go to frankincense trees. I bought frankincense in the market there. There's a lot of frankincense, but the trees are not on the coast proper. The trees, there's a coastal plain, and then you go up into the hills, and it's in the hills that you get the frankincense trees. You slash the tree with an axe or a knife, and the sap comes out and dries, and that's frankincense. And it's sort of a yellowish, hard tree sap. The camels, I think, were wild, but were usable. I mean, it is one of the curiosities, I think, of animal behavior is that animals that grow up without natural predators are looked upon as naturally tame from an American or European point of view. So that as desert animals that do not have major predators, I think that it was not terribly difficult for humans to put a rope around their neck, because I think the camel didn't notice very much, and if the person pulling the rope, the camel would go along with them. Camels are considered irascible, and yet they have characteristics that are extremely accepting of what other animals would be disturbed by. For example, being shot. The British Camel Corps that went against the Mahdi in the Sudan, they would have their camels crouched down, and the soldier would use the camel as his shield and for firing back at the Mahdi's army. And then after the battle, they would see how often their camel had been shot, because the camel didn't show any particular reaction. And in the British Army reports in India say, well, when the cannons go off, the horses just start jumping around. The camels don't take any particular notice of cannons. They do have things that alarm them, but they're not the things that are associated with human manipulation. So I think carrying goods started there in Southern Arabia, and eventually turned into a camel trade along the Hijaz coast in Arabia, and the camels reached the northern end of the Arabian desert as domestic animals, or at least usable animals, manageable animals, by 1600 BC. The pattern changes around 300 BC when you have a new type of saddle that's developed, although the baggage saddle remains pretty much the same as it had been before that. So the important thing is, what is it that turns the nomads into outcasts, from being outcasts to being essential parts of the economy? And I think that has to do with the development of military capacity using new camel saddle designs that set in at around 300 BC that enabled some Arab groups to take control of the trade that had passed through their lands long before then. And as they took charge of it, they made being Arab acceptable, because Arabs became rich. If you become rich, you become acceptable. That's a sort of universal human pattern. So that you actually end up, of course, having 1 or 2 or 3 Arabs becoming emperors of Rome. But the particular issue of the Sahara, the trade across the Sahara is described in Arabic sources as involving an exchange of gold for salt. And it's actually, I believe, a three-party trade, that the salt deficiencies of the of the forest regions of Africa required an import of salt. The salt that was available was from saline deposits in the Sahara Desert. So I think you had a salt for agricultural and forest products that developed between nomads in the south and the forest people who live south of them. When the northerners made their move into the south, I think that essentially they latched on to a trade that was already there, and that but they added a new dimension. They could bring products from the north, particularly manufactured products like beads, things like that, and exchange them for nomads in the south for salt, and then they could sell the salt for gold dust. Now, the reason gold dust was so available was that it had no use, and there was apparently no comprehension that the people in the north valued gold in such an extraordinary fashion and coined it. So it's once the southern parties to this trade figured out how valuable gold was in the north, the gold for salt exchange disappeared. I think that is certainly the time of Mansa Musa, who brings a caravan to Cairo from Mali and brings thousands of pounds of gold with him that have been fashioned into ornaments of different sorts. He ruined the gold market in Cairo for years by bringing so much gold. By that time, they have figured out that the gold is valuable. And that's, 14th century, I believe, right? Yeah, and that's in the 14th century. But if you go back to the 8th century or the 9th century, when you're just beginning to have contact from the north, you have this bizarre salt for gold exchange. And then once the people in the south realize how phenomenally valuable gold is in the north, I think that's when the slave trade kicks in. I think that humans became a commodity crossing the Sahara Desert because the profitability of the gold for salt pattern disappeared. So what you have in the center of the Sahara is sort of a vast area where people didn't know what was going on the opposite side, and that gets filled in. As for how uniform the spread of camels is, wherever you go in the Sahara, there are camels. But how many camels there are once you get out of the oasis areas, I don't know how widespread they are there. You don't have any wild camels because those are restricted to Arabia. But by the time you get to southern Algeria, you clearly have a lot of camels of the southern variety. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
So there is a question from Nidal Zahari, where she asks you, so are there any carts, wheels used in this trade being pulled by a horse or camel or donkey as a significant transport, as a significant transport, as a cart wheel can carry large liquid?
Yes, the answer is no. You have no wheeled vehicles in use from Pakistan across to Morocco with some very limited exceptions. You do have camel carts in Pakistan that are exactly how they originate, I don't know. Then you have no wagons or carts that I'm aware of all the way across, except there in the Cap-Bone Peninsula of Tunisia and in some of the oasis areas of Tunisia. You have harnessing of wheeled vehicles that went from the Roman period, but otherwise not. And that's, if you read travelers over the centuries, this is pretty consistently reported that there are no wheeled vehicles. But the technology of wheels for throwing pottery or water wheels, that technology existed. There was nothing against wheels, but they were not used for transport.
I have a question about the breeding of the camels. The Bucht variant, the hybrid between one hump and two hump. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So,
My question is about breeding of camels. You mentioned the Bucht variant, which is the hybrid between the one hump and the two hump, and I seem to recall that you mentioned that the two hump is identical to the Bactrian camel. Is that yeah? And that's mostly Central Asia, Northern Asia, and Eastern Asia, or where? Well, I'm not sure the spread, but then the Bucht variant implies that the Bactrian and the one hump interbred on purpose, I assume, or by accident, but that it started somewhere maybe like Afghanistan. But the Bucht is stronger and more hardy and produces greater meat and every other variation. Did the Bucht variant just replace, when we see the illustrations of camel caravans that either cross the Sahara, are those really simply variants of the one hump, or are they Bucht variants? And why didn't they just dominate the entire camel world?
Hybrid animals often have reproductive issues, so that it's extremely rare for a mule to produce offspring. Although the Bucht are not infertile, but if they breed with one another, the resulting animal is considered to be a uneconomical, poorly developed animal. So nobody wants to breed the Buchts with one another. If you breed a Bucht with either parent, it breeds back to the original. So that you cannot have a breeding herd entirely of Buchts. Buchts are an industrial product that you manufacture, sort of like a mule in the American South. You deliberately create a Bucht for the purpose of selling it or renting it as a laboring animal. So the only places where you have the Bucht important are the ones where you have overlaps between the range. The Bactrian range was Central Asia, Mongolia, was now Northwest China, and it extended into Turkmenistan and the Caspian Sea area, with apparently a small number in Iran. I don't think Iran was ever part of the general area of the two-hump camel. But these are all cold weather areas, and the caravans of purely two-hump camels are winter caravans that cross Central Asia in the Silk Road. The Bucht was not used east of Uzbekistan. In other words, you had a Bucht might reach might reach China with the trade, but there's no breeding of buchs east of Uzbekistan, I don't believe. But you did have the breeding extending up into the Volga Valley and the southern Ukraine, Crimea. But you had none in Africa, none in Arabia. You had some in eastern Turkey. But it was, the industry depends upon the geography, and the animals themselves cannot sustain their hybrid vigor.
Thank you, Professor Bullitt. Another one of your star students and my dear, very dear colleague, Karen Pinto, first of all says, bravo, Professor Bullitt, so wonderful to hear your expansive theories in lecture form again. And she wants you to expand on the McCormick's work, if you please, and Professor Willard, please pay attention that there are other questions, yeah. So that's Karen wants you to please talk about the McCormick work a little.
All right, McCormick's book is over 700 pages long and exceedingly detailed, and probably cannot be fully appreciated in the time that we have here. But I would point out one thing, is that when he gets toward 900, into the 9th century, he places a lot of emphasis on the rise of river routes. And that is important, not for the Middle East, because there are no rivers to speak of other than the Nile, Tigris, and the Euphrates. But the river routes that go up through Russia in the 10th century have deposited thousands and thousands of Iranian coins in hoards that are found on the islands in the Baltic Sea, in Poland, and in Scandinavia. In order to get all that coinage to the river system ends with at the mouth of the Volga, flowing into the northern shore of the Caspian Sea. But that's 1,000 miles from the place where the coins are being made. And so it shows that Eastern Iran gets into the economic system that McCormick talks about in the form of providing the coinage that fuels the trade. The reason there are so many coins, I think, is that when the Scandinavians brought goods downstream, they floated and they went with the current. But getting back upstream is a real pain. Whereas coins are a lot easier to carry than goods.
Anybody from the floor? Yes, yes.
I'm not familiar with the topic. I come from political science background, but I just have a question out of curiosity, because I know in Islamic tradition, horse riding is an essential part. So were there no horses involved in this commutes, traveling, or were they just preserved for battleship, let's say, or were they like mixed caravan of camels and horses? So this is out of curiosity.
Horses were almost exclusively used for military purposes. And it was one of the things that non-Muslims were not allowed to do, according to Muslim tradition in the medieval period, was ride on horses. Not so much because they didn't want to ride on it, they thought it was bad to ride on a horse, but because that would be a signal that they were military. The rival of the camel was the donkey, which has similar abilities to use desert vegetation and so on. And regrettably, the economic history of the donkey is almost completely unwritten. I spent 40 years collecting donkey lore, but it was almost all dealing with the symbolism of donkeys and the role of donkeys in religious and other things, not on their economic functioning. And that's a great lacuna in our technological history of the zone. The camels and the donkeys would be in the same caravan, at least for some purposes.
Thank you, Professor Bullitt. We're going to have to wrap it up, but this is a question that is of much interest by Lyubomir Malinov. I hope I have not mispronounced. And they thank you for this wonderful conference and economic perspective on the concept of long antiquity, Professor Bullitt. If I can address a question, was there a concurrence between Indian Ocean, Red Sea, shipbound, and camel caravan commercial activity? Thank you.
In the period I'm focusing on, I don't think there is much connection. Notably in the Persian Gulf, the primary seaport of Siraf collapsed and disappeared in the middle of the 900s. I think that the camel merchants were hostile to maritime trade, so that all of the seaports that have been so important during late antiquity, whether it was Alexandria or Beirut or Ephesus, they all dwindle once the economic system of the caravan gets underway. So I think that there was a distinct hostility toward the maritime trade. Perhaps one of the reasons the Jewish minority are so prominent in the maritime trade. The goods are important and they're brought in, but you don't have that much of a connection with the interior trade routes. That changes over time. When you get up to the 17th century, carrying goods to Izmir across Anatolia is a huge trade, specifically to deliver goods to a seaport like Izmir for transshipment into Europe. But I think that that really, when you're talking about what ended the medieval period, and a lot of what ended the medieval period was new maritime technologies and discoveries that superseded the efficiencies of the camel caravan system. So I think if you'd asked me the question of how did the medieval system end, I would have aimed at the same economic structure. Not that the caravan system disappeared, but that it became subordinated to the maritime, and the new maritime system becomes the dominant one for the world, moving up into early modern times.
Thank you very much, Professor Bullitt. You're welcome. So we have to wrap up, but I have a quick question if I can get it. I mean, it's a long question, but a quick answer. I've been working on the Az tribe, as you know, the Az tribe, and these they have been settled in Iran, in southern Iran and southwestern Iran, from prior to the Arab conquest, yes, and so I wonder whether the fact that there are no camels there has something to do with that, with the fact that you're dealing with a sedentary population, right? And I found it very interesting that you talked about Arab settlements in southern Hindu Kush as well as, northern parts of it in Balkh. I wonder whether you can say um, anything connected with the fact that I think there was a direct route of trade between northern Hindu Kush and southern parts in Afghanistan, yeah, and to not only southern Iran, but also to the subcontinent, northwestern subcontinent. So I wonder what camel has to do with that.
Okay, the second part first. Um, it's quite clear that there was a very important trade route that went from Central Asia down across the Hindu Kush um, uh, into Pakistan, India, and probably southern Iran. And that we have lots of evidence for that, particularly from Chinese sources. And the how that trade was carried remains uncertain in my mind. It goes back to the Kushan period, and the Kushanas, I think, were aware of camels in the north, two up camels, but I don't think they used them on that route. But they may have. I don't know. I haven't run across anything. As for the first question about the settlement of the Azd in Iran, in southwest Iran, um, in the pre-Islamic period, I didn't know the Azd settled in southwest Iran. So I'm eager to read the results of your research. But if the Azd were there, my guess is they had camels with them.
Well, unfortunately, thank you so much. Everybody is thanking you for your great talk, Professor Bourlet, online as well. Thank you very much for starting the circle with us, and it was a great pleasure having you being our inaugural speaker. I want to once again thank John Turpey. I want to thank everybody for coming here, and all of you that are watching us. Thank you so much. Please spread the word. The circle is here to stay. The next event that we will be having will be probably online. So please pay attention. And there are, I wonder whether, yeah? Okay, let me see the final comment. Okay. Karen agrees with me that that is a great question. Thank you, Karen. I love you. And he has something, she wanted to add something, but we are out of time. So, huh? Oh, happy birthday. Thank you. I didn't know.
On Sunday, I turn 83.
Oh.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for that enlightening talk, Professor Bullet. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being with us. And we will continue the circle. And all of you, please, if you're coming to New York, we don't have funding that much yet. We're going to have some, hopefully, in the future. Let us know, and we would be delighted to have you talking in our circle. Thank you very much, everybody. And with that, have a nice day, everybody, and evening.